What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, and we're back with the next phase in our classical music journey and playlist. I mentioned when I was going through the Rossini overtures that I plan to go through some Mozart after that, and we are going to begin doing that today. Afterward, we're going to go through a Smetana CD sent by Michaela. Big shout out to you. But yes, in the meantime, I want to go through some Mozart, beginning with his 40th Symphony, one of his more famous, certainly I think the first movement, which we're going to start with in this reaction, is often included on Mozart Greatest Hits compilations. It also features the 41st Symphony, Jupiter, which I think for many music aficionados is considered his masterpiece among his symphonies. But it also features number 35, given the name Hafner, I think because of one of his patrons. Nevertheless, I think it's a really nice symphony. It's sprightly in parts, it's a bit shorter than some of his other symphonies, and I really do think it's great, and again, maybe underappreciated, so I want to go through that one as well. But I did also drag out a Divertimento, which is given the catalog number K563, and this one it features Yo-Yo Ma on cello as well as some other musicians, so we'll talk about that when the time comes. And as you can see, I have a couple Mozart operas here, including The Marriage of Figaro, conducted by Sir George Solti, and I'm trying to remember what year this is from. Does it say it here? It doesn't. This is an older one, as is this symphony CD that we're about to go through. But yes, also I have a Don Giovanni box set, so that one can be part of our journeys as well. The point is, I'm going to go through Symphony 40 in 4 movements, and then after that, I'll see what people want to go through among these other Mozart materials, or indeed one of the other symphonies on here. And we'll go through a few of those, we'll go through a Mozart phase in this classical music journey, and then as I said, after that we'll go through the Smetana CD that I have waiting. So yes, we're going to begin going through Mozart's 40th Symphony. This is performed by the Berlin Philharmonic and conducted by Herbert von Karajan. And yes, ultimately this symphony, as I said, I think is considered certainly the first movement, but maybe overall a very notable piece in his larger body of work. I do enjoy the slightly mysterious and suspenseful atmosphere of this first movement, which is it a Molto Allegro? Yes, a Molto Allegro. So yes, this is from 1971, a performance by the Berlin Philharmonic and Herbert von Karajan conducting of the Symphony No. 40 in G minor, which is given the catalog number K550, and away we go. thing where if you've ever been to a classical concert, you often hear a lot of coughs and people adjusting things in the brief moments between the movements because they're trying to be respectful and hold off on clearing their throat or otherwise making a commotion during an actual performance of a movement. But yes, again, it's an iconic piece. It's one that I think is often used in movies and TV shows. Maybe not as much as his A Little Night Music. I think that's probably the one that's used most often in modern performances. And speaking of the word modern, I was thinking while I was listening to that, that progression of Baroque music, the classical era, the Romantic period, I feel like maybe there's more of a shift between Baroque and classical than between classical and Romantic, even if there's certainly characteristics which you can say are specific to each era. But as I was listening at first, I was thinking, in one regard, it's so characteristic of the classical era and, of course, Mozart's work in particular, which I think in some music historian and academic circles is considered the culmination of the classical period because it was right on the cusp of what would become the Romantic era after that, and it sort of synthesized everything that had been building during the period, which, we historians talk about periodization. It's not something that's happening at the time. It's something which retrospectively you look back and you assign, often subjectively. Different historians will have different opinions, but characteristics to certain spans of time, and that might vary depending geographically where you are. People talk about the European Enlightenment, but depending on which country you're in, the dates or the time period can be seen as slightly different. But again, I think Mozart's work is very much telltale classical era, and there's some moments in there where you feel that it's evolved from, let's say, the more distantly historical Baroque sounding pieces, whether again you're talking Bach or Vivaldi. But there's also some moments in there, and especially when it gets toward the latter half of the movement and it gets a bit more busy and powerful, where I feel like it's presaging some stylings and some sounds that you would hear in the Romantic era. And in particular, I'm thinking of Beethoven, which, I don't know how historically verified this is, but my understanding, I learned a while ago, or at least read somewhere a while ago, that in his early youth, Beethoven took a piano lesson or played a recital for, or otherwise met an adult Mozart, and the adult Mozart, after a short time, again, I think they were both on the piano, or maybe Beethoven was playing for Mozart, but Mozart predicted a bright future for the young Beethoven, and of course he turned out to be very correct in that regard. But I was thinking, during parts of this movement, if I didn't know better, and if you put this inside maybe the 7th Symphony or the 9th Symphony of Beethoven, I would believe it. I would think, this really does have a bit of that Romantic era drama and intensity and some of the sonic characteristics that became emblematic of the period following Mozart. So in a way, I think Mozart's work, and maybe a symphony like this, later in his symphonic output, it culminates or synthesizes much of what came before, but is also very forward-looking and peeking to the horizon of what was yet to come. So I think it's a testament to not only Mozart's incredible skill and genius composition. I do believe he's one of the people where applying the word genius is not hyperbole, it is not an exaggeration. I think his compositions really do suggest genius. Speaking of which, and before I talk more about what we heard, this is a good time to mention that I've been wanting to do a watch-along of Amadeus, which I get, there's some creative liberties and license in that film historically, meaning history, I think, or people who study the past, seem to suggest that Mozart and Salieri were not nearly as antagonistic toward each other as it suggested in that film, and that Salieri actually was quite fond of Mozart's music at the time and took great offense when there were people following Mozart's death who suggested that he may have had a hand in it, that he may have sabotaged Mozart. I believe he was deeply hurt by those claims. So it wasn't unheard of back then. Peter Schaeffer didn't entirely invent that narrative, but I do believe it was exaggerated and taken creative liberty in the... Was it a play first? I think it was a play first, then it was made into a film, right? But the point is, I've been wanting to do a watch along of that film for a long time, which has an incredible series of performances of Mozart's work. And I believe it's Sir Neville Mariner who is conducting the orchestra that's heard in the soundtrack to the film. And I feel like now that we're starting a Mozart chapter of my classical music reactions, it would be a perfect time to do that. So in the coming weeks, maybe by the time we finish this symphony, and while we're figuring out together people who follow my classical reactions, again, Michaela, Jupiter 2 Mission, there's been a few other people. I think the Beethoven reactions had the most people commenting, which, again, Beethoven, it's one of those names, like Mozart or Bach, where there's just people from all different walks of life and around the world who are fond of their music. So maybe that will be a case, or the case, here when we begin going through Mozart. And if you are new here, welcome. There's a lot of classical music reactions already in the playlist, and I welcome you to offer your opinion as to which of these works, again, a divertimento, a performance of The Marriage of Figaro, or a performance of Don Giovanni, which I feel like I've heard The Marriage of Figaro from start to finish at least a couple times in my life, and at least once from this CD compilation which I inherited from my dad, or this CD recording of it. But I feel like I've seen or heard Don Giovanni a great deal less. Now again, in Amadeus the film, I'd say the latter third of the film really focuses around that and the Requiem, but ultimately you don't hear the whole opera, of course, in the movie. So I would maybe, at the start of this chapter in the classical music journey, say that whether or not we do it next, at some point I'd like to go through at least some of Don Giovanni, because I understand it to be, dense and dark and in some ways different from a lot of his other work, which is a bit lighter, more accessible, more catchy, to use a modern term. So yes, ultimately I will do a watch-along of Amadeus, which will probably need to be on my Patreon, because I don't edit it. The way people do music watch-alongs here on YouTube is they'll take a 2-hour movie and they'll just keep chopping it up to the point where it gets through the YouTube algorithms, and inevitably it'll be like half the length of the actual movie, and some scenes that maybe fans are fond of get cut out just because that might have triggered the algorithm. And of course, the way I do watch-alongs, the screen is big and my little face bubble is very small, whereas I think a lot of people who do movie watch-alongs here on YouTube, it's reverse, where the video with the movie is pretty small and it's mostly the screen is the reactor, which I get that it might help, but from the very beginning of these reactions and watch-alongs, it's always been like, I'm here to provide commentary, maybe a little bit of insight, certainly my visceral appreciation of what I'm listening to or watching, but I'm not the star of what's happening. The star is the movie, the TV show, the symphony, the pop track, whatever it is. So I stand by that, but the point is it'll probably need to be over on my Patreon, though I will try to get it up here on YouTube. Nevertheless, I will try to do that in the coming weeks, again, maybe by the time we finish this symphony. So yes, what I was also going to say about the symphony itself, or this movement rather, the opening motif, which is, I think, the most recognizable and iconic part of this movement, and maybe the symphony overall, I love the way it evolves over the course of the movement. And maybe the first couple articulations are more or less identical, but by the time you get halfway through the piece, when it comes around again, it has a different second half, or the second half of the first part of that recurrent theme. It has a different feel, and then when you get into the latter stages of the movement, it evolves again, and it's busier. It has more other motifs happening at the same time. So I like where, I talked in a lot of the Rossini reactions, where he keeps bringing back the same themes, so it becomes familiar, and you've only just heard it, but when you hear it a second time, a third time, it's still very exciting and new, but your brain already knows that dialect, that phrase, and so it has a familiarity and maybe even a nostalgia, even again on a first listening. And there's something similar happening here, but again, it evolves more than some of the recurrent themes in those Rossini overtures, even if those, of course, evolve a little bit as well, give or take, depending on which overture you're talking about. But yes, so I like the way this the main theme of this continues to come back, but it keeps you guessing a little bit, and it keeps altering, and the feel of it, the way it hits, is a little bit different each time. So I will say I've heard this movement played faster than this, and I think I've also heard it played slower than this. So, I often talk about if you hear a performance the first time, that becomes ingrained in your head as to, oh, well, that's just the way this is played. And of course, that was itself a choice, an interpretation by the conductor, and of course, the skill of the players and so on. So it might not be the standard tempo or the nice middle range tempo given all the performances of this that have ever been played. But for me, having heard it a little bit faster and a little bit slower, this feels just about right in terms of the tempo, the interpretation of the tempo. So yes, a really great opener. We'll be back for movement 2 pretty soon. Let me know what you think of this, and I will see you next time. Peace.